Morning all. I think we will get underway. We've got reasonable quorum of participants online. I'd ask people who aren't speaking at the webinar this morning just to mute themselves. That would be very helpful because we do have like well over 100 and something people joining, so it would be preferable that you mute your audio, please. Good morning again, and thank you all for joining us for today's virtual roundtable, Ethical AI in Banking, a Human Rights Perspective. For those who don't know me, I'm Amanda Pullinger. I'm Head of Customer Policy at the ABA. And I'd like to begin this morning by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet. For us here at the ABA, we're located on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present and respects any Aboriginal people joining us today. Onto the topic of today. Look, as AI becomes more central to banking, I think we all know it's vital we don't just ask what AI can do, because it can do many things, but what should it do, I think is the question. And that is a conversation about placing people at the centre of the technological change and how we're using the technology, and ensuring that human rights remain sort of that guiding compass as we all innovate. We're joined today by National Australia Bank and the Australian Human Rights Commission to explore how an ethical framework and human rights principles can help shape the future of AI in banking. We're delighted today to welcome one of the Australian Human Rights Commissioners, Lorraine Finlay. In her role, Lorraine leads work at the Commission in areas including modern slavery, asylum seekers, refugees, business and human rights, and technology and human rights. So welcome, Lorraine. Prior to joining the Commission, Lorraine also worked as a long career as a lawyer and academic specialising in human rights and public law. And her insights will help guide us through some of the most pressing questions and accountabilities and how we deal with bias and things like that we need to consider in terms of the use of AI. Joining Lorraine in conversation is NAB's Head of Privacy and Data Ethics, Advice in Enterprise Data, and that's Jade Ha. And Jade has worked in varying legal roles in relation to human rights, including First Nations issues, privacy and data. And Jade and obviously Lorraine have worked on producing the guide that we will be discussing today. Now, before I hand over, there's going to be quite a bit of time at the end for questions, so please feel free to add your questions during the conversation via the chat function. But I really look forward to quite an inspiring discussion, actually, and very keen to understand the insights around the sort of origins of this and how NAB have been using this as well. So over to you, Jade.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome, Lorraine. Thank you all. Thank you so much for just being able to share your time with ABA members this morning. I think there's no doubt that everyone on the phone call is very aware that automation is increasingly becoming a key area for banks. And financial services will be really wanting to use and expecting to use AI to assist with many different areas of our workflow, be it from our customer service start or right up to risk management. But it is also really critical that while we're looking at all these new technologies, that we're also understanding that with advancements can come costs, and it's really ensuring that we are balanced and considered in how we implement these new advancements. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity, I think, through the ABA to hear from the Human Rights Commissioner, and I think together we both hope that today's roundtable will provide a genuine open opportunity to discuss the Human Rights Impact Assessment tool. And we can use this session as a dialogue starter. Why using a human rights framework is a good idea for assessing AI tools, not only for for the organisations doing it, but for very importantly, the customers impacted. So to kick off, Lorraine and I have a few questions to just keep this like really nice and open conversation for everyone on the call. I think it's going to be really important to just dig in a little bit into the history, the background of the tool, the origin story, so to speak, and then we'll just flow some other questions as that makes sense as we go through. And please, just supporting what Amanda said, please do add your questions. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love this to be more of a conversation, and if it makes sense, we can always splice things into our questions. So without further ado, Lorraine, would you kindly please explain to the members on the call today what exactly is the Human Rights Impact Assessment Tool and a little bit about how it came about?
Absolutely. And firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Thanks to the ABA for bringing us all together, but particularly to NAB and to Jade for being part of this partnership with the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'll talk a little bit about the origin story and, what the tool is and why we thought it was so important. But beyond the tool itself, I actually think the partnership that we had continue to have between NAB and the Commission in developing this tool is, to me, a really positive example of a partnership that brings together human rights and business expertise to show how human rights can actually be implemented into day-to-day business in a way that's designed to be practical and encourage innovation and ethics, rather than being just another regulatory burden and something that gets in the way of what your business is trying to accomplish. So I think it's a great example of human rights and business really walking hand in hand to create something that hopefully will bring benefits across the board. And really that's what the HRIA tool, the Human Rights Impact Assessment Tool, is meant to do. It's meant to be a really practical framework to help businesses assess the human rights impacts of AI-informed decision-making systems. And we developed it in direct response to recommendations that came out of our 2021 Australian Human Rights Commission Technology and Human Rights Final Report, which is a huge mouthful, but which basically was a report that made recommendations across the board in terms of technology and human rights. And one of the things that it called on was for private sector bodies to be encouraged to undertake human rights impact assessments and to develop tools to assist them in doing so. And NAB reached out to the Commission after seeing this recommendation right back in 2021, 2022, and we started talking about how could we bring it to life and how could we create something that would actually not just tell banks that they need to think about these issues, but actually help provide the support that brings that to life and actually makes it happen.
It's amazing. And I know that I definitely feel like we were in a privileged position to be able to partner with the Human Rights Commission and work together on this tool. So I personally really do truly believe that a human rights approach is so very important for organisations in understanding how the use of data can impact our customers, our employees, our colleagues, and whether that's at a very fundamental perspective, so how do we protect these human rights, and also to just trying to figure out what we can do to do better to try and predict those unforeseen circumstantial consequences as well. So yeah, there's definitely from our perspective an interest just to understand what we could learn, what we could do more of in regards to appreciating the human rights protection obligations in our own reviews and assessments. So, and I definitely echo your sentiment about things need to be practical, and I think working together we've shown that. So, would you mind sharing perhaps some of your thoughts or hopes that you had for the tool initially, and then perhaps, or how did you see or envisage that the tool would ultimately be picked up by others and used?
What's interesting, before getting to that, something that you said that I actually think was an underlying hope I had for the tool was, often when we talk about human rights, it's actually a bit of a scary concept for people, particularly in business, because straight away you think human rights is going to create this huge compliance burden. It is so big. There's so much to it. I'm not quite sure that I fully understand what the implications are. And so people tend to hesitate and step back. What I hope this tool does is actually make it really accessible. And one of the things that I still reflect on, Jade, in our process of putting the tool together was the number of conversations we had where at the Commission we'd be talking in, very theoretical human rights language, and then the people we were talking to from your side would say, but they're just common sense questions that of course we'd ask. and so actually a lot of human rights sounds scary perhaps from the beginning, but actually is about common sense things that I would imagine most businesses are thinking about in any event. So what we're hoping with this tool is to actually bring it into that human rights language and create a bit of a structure around it so that we have something that is more than just a compliance mechanism or a sort of tick the box exercise, but that's actually a practical open source resource that can help support ethical innovation. We know that AI is here to stay. We know that it's increasingly becoming part of our lives. So how can we embed human rights considerations into those decision-making processes, not just as an afterthought when things have gone badly and we're trying to react to something that's gone wrong, but right from the beginning so that we can preempt some of those things and actually stop harms from happening in the first place. And so what the tool does by trying to help identify and risk assess human rights issues early is to prevent harm, to actually help build trust and to support accountability. And it's really intended, again, not as a conversation stopper, but as a starter, as something to help us develop further conversations about how is this impacting the decisions that we're making? What are the impacts that we're seeing? And how can we ensure outcomes that not only are great for customers, but also great for the business more generally?
I really agree, and I think what's really interesting is my team, we use the word ethics a lot, but I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about human rights, these are legal obligations. We are talking about compliance, but like you say, it doesn't have to be something where you feel overwhelmed with the complexity of it when you actually look at specific human rights as they apply to what sort of business as usual activities banks would be doing. It's easy to identify these are rights that we need to be mindful of, and then just trying to practically speak it through. And I think one of the things we can sometimes feel working in banking is that we operate in a compliance heavy ecosystem, but it is really, really important to recognise that human rights isn't an opt-in. It's not a nice to have. It applies to private and public organisations. So yeah, whether you're developing or deploying a particular AI tool, having that framework, that mindset, I think at the beginning is just a really great, like you say, conversation starter. It's not an end to something, and the tool is designed that you can step through it. And we'll definitely talk a bit more about how we apply it in real life, so to speak. So with that in mind, now that hopefully people are feeling like, this is something I can relate to, and it sounds very pragmatic and practical. Do you see any, or what do you see as the sort of target use cases that perhaps people on this call should be thinking about to apply to the tool?
I think it is really important to recognise this is not a one-size-fits-all model. What the tool really recognises is not all processes or decisions carry the same risks. And so they don't all need the same level of analysis or the tool to be engaged to the same degree with every single decision that's made by an AI system or that engages with an AI decision-making system. So it's really designed to be fully used in situations where AI is a material factor in decision-making, and also when that decision has a legal or similarly significant effect on an individual. So that might include decisions around creditworthiness, eligibility for banking products, pricing, vulnerability identification, automated advice and the like. But it's not designed for minor or assistive uses of AI, but rather really tries to focus on those things that carry a particular risk of harm or particular consequences for individuals, recognising that we know there are some individuals that are more vulnerable to the impacts of this than others.
Yes, and I think again, reflecting on that sort of practical side of it, I think banks, or common sense part of it, banks can be really good about thinking about the customer. We talk about putting the customer at the heart of what we do. At NAB, we specifically talk about customer obsession. So, you know, it really is just a level up of your common sense understanding to say, when you're saying customer, can you think about human rights? Because it may sound obvious, but your customer are people, and so it's just not language. I think this is the thing that we just talked about before. It's just not a common sort of vernacular in banking. But we actually do think about these things, but we frame it in the way of customer obsession or other types of sort of customer focused language. So and for us as well, we you know, if it's AI that's relating to a customer or our colleagues, our employees, then we would typically follow the approach. And I totally agree. It's something to consider, but it may be that whatever your output is or the outcome of the AI, it may not hit that materiality factor, or it may not be a significant effect. We've sort of nonetheless just leaned into it because it does feel like we're ramping up so much more on various uses of AI. So we're sort of probably going a little bit more is more at the moment when it comes to looking at things. But I do genuinely think that's because we're all on a big learning curve, and as our customers become more comfortable, we become more comfortable in various things, and our regulators become more comfortable in various things, then I think that sort of framework, you know, you could ease up the pedal or dial the pedal down, so to speak. So, and I guess I would just call out too, just for everyone on the call, that when I say AI, I'm definitely talking about it quite broadly. You know, it could be things like an automation, a generation of content, summarization, personalization, detection. But it still just may not be that all the questions in the tool are going to be absolutely like the full, you know, caboodle is required, because you know, it just isn't a significant effect. So you may not need to consider absolutely everything, but I do think I sort of start open funnel and then sort of to figure out where you land. So we just to sort of reflect on our application, we our most really recent use cases have really been focusing on generative AI. But if it is a model, if it's machine learning, if it's AI, simple or sophisticated, we still follow our data ethics assessment, which has these questions in it. So some general use cases for us have included looking at customer complaints management, personalized communications, and the use of AI in the fraud detection capability sort of space. So one specific thing is we're using an AI platform for better call analytics. So ultimately, we want to try and assess what are the drivers for calls, what are the themes, how do we help our bankers, you know, with coaching or development. Now, there are many ways you could implement analytics tools, and we've probably all read about often the not so good ways. And I think one of the letdowns when you sort of hear about when things perhaps don't go as well is they're not thinking through all of the impacts that can happen from the end users. And again, I just strongly say, if you're having this human rights approach, you can step through it, and if it's not required, you know, you've got to the point and you can you know, teeter off. You know, it's really common to record phone calls, but it's not common to transcribe every phone call in everyday life today. And it's also not common to review every single or QA every single phone call. So there's all these things, and not all phone calls are equal. So there's a number of things, I think, when we're thinking about, you know, does that really need to have a deeper analysis? You know, work through, understand what your purpose is, what your data is, and trying to understand from the customer's acceptance and understanding of this, but also how it impacts your bankers, your people? How are they interacting with things like this? Because I do think when you do step through even things which may sound simple like call recordings, you actually do have to realise that there are new considerations that through the use of AI, different risks can arise, and you follow this approach, I think it really does assist. And I've got some other examples if people want to talk a bit more in detail about that. I'm happy to go into that. And I mean, I guess I'd probably just add just about the use cases is that I think banks are very good at understanding privacy. You know, we came from an industry where we've got deep historical roots in confidentiality. So privacy is an easy thing to grasp when we're talking about data risks and AI risks, but we don't always think about that privacy is a human right. And again, it's just flipping it a little bit. It's just sort of elevating things, leveling up. You know, if you've got privacy ingrained, it's a pivot to focus, right? Okay, human rights. What other freedoms and rights should we be thinking about? We know how to do. We've got privacy. We understand. We've got people in the business that talk to us on this. How are we going to explore equality, or how are we going to explore non-discrimination when it comes to these sorts of possible, you know, protections?
I think part of that, Jade, if I could just quickly, is recognising that AI is a new tool effectively, but all of the existing human rights requirements apply as much to AI as they do in the real world. So things like privacy, we can't just park to one side and ignore when it comes to AI. All of those things still matter. But also, I think it's really important what you raised, the tool can actually be a starting point just in recognising the use of AI. Because sometimes at the moment, it feels as though everybody's just so keen to adopt it that we're actually not aware of how we are using it. And we're not aware of how ingrained it already is in so many of our business processes. And the real risk there is we're adopting technology because we kind of feel like it's inevitable and we have to, rather than recognising we need to make conscious decisions about how we use this, how we shape it, how we approach it. And using something like the HRIA tool is a really useful way of just turning your minds to those questions and being curious about the way that you're using AI in day-to-day work and the impacts that it might have.
Absolutely. That sort of pause and consider, and it doesn't mean you know, it doesn't stop innovation. We want to enable the safe use of data for responsible innovation in AI.
I'd go one step further and say it enhances innovation, because if you're known as a person or a business that engages with AI in a responsible and ethical way, it allows for public trust to be built, which then allows for stronger engagement and connection. So that public trust and accountability element is actually really critical. And unfortunately, at the moment, the research is showing that Australians have the lowest levels of trust in AI from around the world. And that is something we really do need to correct if we're going to get the productivity gains that we need to from AI.
I know, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've heard of the the National AI Centre, really trying to drive the adoption, but it's still, surveys are just showing it to be really low in Australia. So I think it's up to industries like banking and financial services, where generally speaking, we are protecting money, we're protecting information. We've got a great privileged position here to be thinking about how can we support through education and safe use and adoption that our customers feel safe to expect certain things.
And I also think and this is where the Commission has a role in being really open and positive about the great use cases that we're seeing. You just mentioned the use of AI in fraud prevention. We often talk about the things that go wrong and the examples that are really concerning. There is a lot of great practice out there where actually AI is being used to strengthen and uplift human rights. And that's something that I'm really keen to be talking about. And I think, again, the HRIA tool is helpful in terms of finding that balance, because it allows you to really talk about those cases where we've thought through the impacts, we've taken steps to make sure this works, and here are the really great outcomes we're getting from it.
Yep, no, that's great. That's fantastic. So bringing the conversation back to, I think we've talked about it before, you know, the tool should not be seen as a compliance checkbox. And I understand that the tool doesn't pop out an answer that says you are compliant with human rights. It doesn't work like that. That's not the point of this tool. So if you could just share a few words with the ABA members on how you see the tool applies to, or how it should be applied.
Well, I mean, I would agree with everything you just said. We don't see this as a tick the box exercise, and the tool is not about creating additional levels of process. It's really designed as a tool that can be integrated into the broader ethical and governance framework that banks have. And so it's designed to be integrated into existing processes, and to be a conversation starter that really prompts reflection, fosters internal dialogue, and actually helps to support that multidisciplinary collaboration across legal, technical, and ethical domains, because this isn't a tool that's designed to have one person who is the person who's meant to deal with the tool and tick all the boxes, and that's the end of it. It's designed to encourage these conversations to actually be integrated right throughout processes. The other thing the tool does that I think is really important is it's not designed to be a set and forget. It's designed to actually encourage continual conversations throughout the life cycle of a product, because we know, particularly when it comes to generative AI, that human rights isn't just a switch that you flick right at the beginning and then you forget about it. Actually, there needs to be this constant process of thinking through what the impacts are. Have things changed? Have they developed? Are we using it in different ways? And when do we need to go back and actually revisit that conversation about what are the impacts, what are the risks, and how do we mitigate those?
Yeah, and I think, like you say, it's very key. The integration of the tool into existing ecosystem is definitely the preferred approach. I mean, I think again, everyone on the call probably recognises that financial services or any heavily regulated industry, we do feel like we probably have enough assessments, and so I always get nervous when I have to front up to people and I think, oh, I'm going to send chills down their spine when I tell them there's another assessment to do. So instead, it's really important to think, how do you incorporate this into your existing toolbox? You know, risk assessments, change assessments. This is something that we all have to do because, like we all know, we've got a lot of other things to be mindful of. And I think depending on the size of your organisation, depending on the types of AI that you're looking at, you know, you should feel empowered to take what you need as you need it from this HRAI as appropriate. There's going to be things that if you're not in that end of the swimming pool, you're down at the other end of the swimming pool, then knowing that it's there, reading it, and learning a bit more about human rights is might be your starting point. And as you move on and develop into more sophisticated, you know, whether it's got a more material effect or you're working into legal or similarly significant effect decisions, then, you know, you're not coming cold to it. So yeah, NAB, we definitely didn't need to go and create an entirely new assessment to incorporate the guidance. We went through all of our existing assessments very carefully. We have an embedded privacy impact assessment process, which probably everyone on this phone call has as well, and we've got an overall change management process, and that's where our PIA gets triggered from. We've also had a data ethics assessment for over 6 years, so for us it just made the most sense to beef up what we had from a human rights perspective. And that way I didn't have to coax anybody. I didn't have to say, oh, you need to. It was part of something that people already knew. I've already done the graft on these other things. So it's really trying to integrate it into pre-existing flows. And I think having a publication of the tool, you know, that allows us to uplift our messaging, how we talk about privacy at NAB. We actually specifically call out privacy as a human right now in our internal training. So we just sort of lent and said, how else can we bolster up this connection? We talk about applying a human rights approach to our assessments of AI to our regulators. And again, I think that's that language piece for us. I've just found it really empowering having publications like this alongside the technology report. It just really switches something, different. And it changes that mindset of let's just plug it in and go to what is the impact? How do we protect our customers and their rights? And I feel like I sound like an evangelist because I'm like human rights. But I just do really think truly it does opens your eyes, your hearts and your mind to thinking about technology in a very practical way. We're not all going to be technological geniuses, but if you think about impacts, you bring it down to the very practical, real life, how the workings. You don't have to be an expert in everything else to understand that.
And again, it's just really emphasising the point that we shouldn't be adopting technology just because we can and just because it's there. At the end of the day, technology is meant to make our lives better, easier, fairer. So thinking about how we do that. And, when you were talking, human rights, again, when it gets right down to it, we can make human rights very complicated, but ultimately human rights is just about how do we treat each other how do I have others treat me the way that I'd like to treat them and vice versa. It's really about fundamentals of treating people with respect and dignity. And so when you bring it down to that level, it's not something that is scary or that needs to be evangelized. It is just something that makes common sense and is, Eleanor Roosevelt, my all-time favorite quote, famously said, human rights begin in small places close to home. And I think that's really true. It's those small decisions that we make that actually have a really big impact on people. And, if that small decision is simply making sure that our use of AI doesn't cause enormous harm to others, that's a really good decision to be making.
100%. And I think that point, talking about considering everything up front and the design phase, I think there's a classic example when people talk about, right, you need to build, you've been checked for accessibility and it's the end of the product or it's at the end of the website. And then suddenly, if you do it at the end, it's at your peril, it's at your cost. Whereas, you have to do it, but it's much better to be thinking about everything like this up front. I mean, I think we talk about privacy by design. I think in my team, we cheekily talk about ethics by design. People talk about security by design. It's everything by design. But that's why it's important to just have those conversations, plan, but also as you mentioned, use cases can change. They can morph. You just cannot do it just once and then be like everything is fine. If you don't have for those of us, if you don't have a particular assessment right now, perhaps starting with the human rights impact assessment as your assessment is fine. But if you do have something that's well established processes, think about how you can beef things up or uplift it, because you will find that it's a language, but we don't want to make it a barrier. We want to make it feel common sense. We want to make it feel real. So whatever language is appropriate, and we update our data ethics assessment fairly regularly, whether it's because we're trying to create more specific questions on AI, or whether it's because I've just got feedback from business and I want them to use it, and I don't, the better they understand and use it better, the better our job is as well. Or there might be a new focus on something particular. So I do think it's important to know that regardless of however we are reviewing things, technology isn't standing still, and neither should our learning. We all need to be thinking about how to adjust and pivot and just tweak. And as long as we can keep doing that, the human rights, they're universal, fundamental. They're not going to be needed. They don't need a tweak, but but we can help with the technology, I think.
If we can approach those conversations from the position of we want to have responsible and ethical use of AI, ultimately that's what's going to drive productivity advances. That's what's going to drive us actually harnessing the benefits of AI, versus if we don't have those conversations, we're going to end up in a position where we're not able to actually gain the benefits that we should be gaining from AI because of the harms that that we've ignored and haven't addressed.
Indeed, and the loss of trust, because I think that's some of the things, isn't it? I think you've got to get better at talking about the successful things, because sadly, there are some not so great examples publicly in Australia, which could be part of the reason why the trust has gone low. But I also feel like, just generally speaking, Australia does have quite a conservative position on privacy. We've had a lot of data breaches over the last few years. People are nervous about their data and don't always appreciate perhaps the nuances that AI is doing with maybe not as much data as they think. Now, a lot has happened since the development of the tool, and I think there's probably been a big shift globally in the use of AI, with a lot more, they talk about the democratization of AI. So with having the privilege of you on this phone call, we'd love to hear what do you see as the view of the Australian Human Rights Commissioner? What are the contemporary issues that are facing perhaps Australia with AI?
This topic of the moment, isn't it? It seems to be everywhere at the moment. I think the first thing just to highlight is I'm about to talk to you about some of my concerns, but ultimately I'm an AI optimist. I think the potential for AI to transform our lives and to have a really positive impact is absolutely there. But we've got to have that early human rights discussion about how we guard against some of those harms. And, in terms of AI, particularly AI in business, the three things I'm really concerned about are, firstly, privacy, because we know that AI relies on vast data sets. It relies often on very sensitive personal information. It manages to profile and link data sets in ways that we haven't previously been able to. And so while the risk to privacy isn't new, it's happening in a way or in a context that perhaps we haven't really experienced before. And I think a lot of people are simply unaware, when they're using AI, of just how the data that they're inputting can be repurposed or exposed. So we really need to get to grips with the privacy aspects. We also need to think about the algorithmic bias and the potential for discrimination. So that's the idea that AI systems can unintentionally replicate discrimination when they're trained on biased historical data. And that's a particular concern in sectors like banking, because it can really impact marginalised groups and just entrench systemic discrimination. And then I think the third thing, which is particularly critical for Australia as a democracy, is the way that AI plays a role in shaping information flows. So we know that generative AI particularly can really spread misinformation, it can hallucinate content, it can amplify hate speech. And so thinking about how we manage that, how we deal with things like deep fakes and disinformation, while still protecting free expression and robust exchanges of information, is really critical. And as the tools develop, how we distinguish between a human and a machine, and when we're having a human conversation versus whether we're getting information from an AI tool, that is something that I think is important and something that we need to grapple with. And so all of those concerns put together just highlight for me the need for human rights centred governance when it comes to AI, and a human rights impact assessment tool is one key aspect of that. Just thinking through, not just how do we just adopt this technology because it's there, because we can, because we think there'll be efficiency gains. One of the things that I'm constantly saying at the moment is I'm really concerned that one of the key efficiency gains we're going to see out of AI is efficiency in breaching human rights. And that's actually not an efficiency gain that we want to be going after. So the more we can have those conversations early, the better we can think consciously about how we're using these tools, the better place we'll be.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think obviously bias and discrimination is such a key thing for everyone, whether it's AI or you're in banking. We've been using models for decades, and it's always something that we need to be very mindful of, is how are we treating different cohorts and groups of customers, and why are they getting treated in that way differently, and what is the specific. So if you can flip it and suddenly customer A is flipped to customer B, and that all we're flipping is something as their gender or their sex. Why? why are we getting a different answer? So again, it's coming back to that curiosity, not just accepting everything as the machine is always right. It's so important, because I think that's just that's the stuff that would keep me up at night, because it's the last thing anyone wants to do. Is we don't set out to do something horrible, but we have to pound the pavement. We have to put our money where our mouth is and actually do the work to make sure we're making sure that these things aren't creating issues.
Yeah, part of that, and it's stepping a little bit outside of the tool, but again, it's thinking through your uses of AI and recognizing there are some things that AI is far better than humans at, and where it absolutely should be used. And there are some things where it's not, and where there are red lines where we should be making the decision to say, actually, this is something a human has to have accountability for. It's not something that we can leave to a machine. So really thinking through those use cases, I think, is an important conversation to have.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, and I hope everyone is paying attention, because I do think that's really, really great advice right from the Commissioner's mouth there. So I would just perhaps just a final question, again relating to the sort of expansion that we've had in the last 2 years. Now, the tool was released before, I would say, generative AI was even a sparkle in the tool's eye. And I know we were focusing on things like creditworthiness of models, using AI to identify or verify our customers. So do you think, just because there's a new AI type in town, that we have to go running around and changing things like the tool?
Simplest answer is no, because the principles that underpin the tool are absolutely still valid. And again, I use the example of our technology and human rights final report was released in late 2021, before AI really exploded. So it touches on AI, but it doesn't really, the technology has just changed so significantly, but the principles that underpin that report are still exactly the same. So in terms of the tool and generative AI, there may need to be a few tweaks. I'd love to see a development to look specifically at guidance around generative AI, but what it really does highlight for me, or the one shift I think that really does occur with generative AI, is reinforcing that idea that you have to engage in these conversations throughout the life cycle of the product. Because what generative AI does to an entirely different degree is it's learning as it goes. And that means the risk of discrimination creeping in is greater perhaps than with some other technologies. The risk of things going down a path that are unexpected is greater than perhaps other technologies, because even tech experts say a lot of the time with these models, they don't really understand how they're operating or what they're going to end up doing. And so actually having those conversations, I think, is even more significant now than perhaps it was even just a few years ago.
Yes, indeed. And our door plug, if anyone hasn't had the opportunity to read the Human Rights Commission's technology report, it's sort of split into 2 sections, one on disability and one specifically on AI. Both sections obviously really equally important, but if you are specifically wanting to learn a bit more on views on the AI piece, please go ahead and read that. It's all available on their website. I do think we've got a question, but perhaps before we go to that, I might just sort of put out a general final question, which I think I just said the last question was the final question, so apologies. But what are your hopes? We've got all these members. We had a large amount of people registered for this session, which is fantastic. What are your hopes for all our ABA members who are listening and will listen to the recording on what they should do in regards to the Human Rights Impact Assessment tool?
I think there are 3 key things. I mean, the first is I just hope it sparks conversations, that actually you go away from this session really curious about thinking through how are we engaging with AI and how can we do that in a human rights centred way. Secondly, I hope the tool is seen as a resource that enhances what you're already doing, and that it's actually used to support ethical innovation, not as a handbrake on innovation and the adoption of AI. But I think the third thing, and this is a much broader hope, is I would hope that the engagement that we had with NAB really stands as a positive example of the types of partnerships that we need in Australia to really start building that trust in AI. And it goes to the question I see that Nick's put up in the chat, which is, you know, one of the most effective ways that we can start to build that trust and really get Australia leading the way in terms of AI adoption and getting the benefits of that is by having those partnerships between government and the private sector, between the Human Rights Commission and business, to make sure that we're thinking about human rights in a really practical way, but also that we're talking in a very public way about the positive work that's happening, the positive impacts, and what we're doing to mitigate against those risks so that we can start to build that trust and confidence.
Fantastic. Amanda, are there...
Hi again. I'm just wondering if anyone else out there has any questions, but while people are thinking about that and typing away, I've got one. It's a little bit more pragmatic and it's probably more for you, Jade, but Lorraine, very interested in your perspective. Look, the ABA has done a lot of work over the years in various, areas of policy innovation. And generally one of the larger banks is often at the forefront of doing some of this work. But one of the questions we always get asked, because others will look at it and go, how do we do this? But it's actually how do you get this started internally? Like, Jade, those initial conversations you had to have internally at NAB about, ensuring your C-suite were on board or making sure you had the right people there. It's more about how do we help get members started on this journey. So
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, of course. Well, definitely, I head up the privacy and data ethics team. This was not just a privacy and data ethics thing. May have been our team reaching out to the commission, but at the end of the day, we absolutely had to make sure we were talking with the other people that were relevant so that we could actually have the right minds, because it is a cross-team, a cross-disciplinary thing when it comes to reviewing this type of technology. I do need to have my data scientists and the people that can crunch that stuff and speak in zeros and ones better than I can. We do have ESG risk team at NAB, so it was making sure that I was involving them as well in this conversation. And legal and other people who work in the data space. And that's probably one of the advantages I have with where my team is structured. We're actually in enterprise data, so we're not seen as a strict compliance team. And for anyone that knows me, ethics is not compliance, but privacy obviously is about, is policy and compliance. So it's very much trying to make sure that when we work together, we're not just saying, this is just a passion project of one person who just really is into this sort of stuff. It has to be accepted. So thankfully I have the support of our Chief Data and Analytics Officer to see that this was something that NAB should be engaging in. I mean, I do, again, that technology report had so many, it was a huge, I'm sure, labour of love for the Commission. There's a lot of stuff, really great stuff in there. And so from that, we were able to sort of say, look, here's direction. We want to be thinking, whether it's ethics, whether it's privacy, whether it's a data risk, we want to be thinking about how to prepare ourselves for the next thing. We know that all this stuff is coming, and even though we've had so much more come with generative AI than we may have thought, everything is moving much faster. So we always knew that you need to be prepared early. And I do think that sort of helped where it's come from for me. And I'm not above, begging for people to help me. I'm relatively easy to get along with, but I do make people attend those meetings and do the work with me, because you want people to actually be able to go through these things, and they may not have looked at or have a really deep understanding of human rights, and that's okay. I want them for their skill set, and I think that's the thing too. When we're looking at all of this, it's about everyone being open to knowing we're not the expert, we are all together, though, going to work really hard so that we can come up with a process. Not every bank is going to have a human rights team, for instance, because they're going to be different sizes, right? And that's just unrealistic. Not every bank has a huge privacy team. And so it's really just trying to figure out who are the right contacts and sort of forming your tribe, if you like, within that. We were really lucky. We were thrilled that the Commission was interested in working with us, and then we just had to do the work, and I think I was always really surprised and grateful that Lorraine was so generous with her time, and I think that also helps when you're trying to talk to people in the business to say, the Commissioner is on these phone calls with us. Like, that's pretty great. Like, we're very lucky to have that sort of commitment at their end as well. So that made it, I think, an easier sell. We all have different approaches to how we advertise things and within the banks. But I do think part of our sort of story in AI has been sort of we're crawling before we run. And a lot of this stuff is sort of laying the stronger foundation so that when we're ready, we can leap. And I think having this partnership is definitely a key thing to that. It also supports, I know other banks have done this as well. We've been, worked collaboratively with the Department of Industry on some of the AI ethics principles and the other work that's fallen out of that. So involved in various case studies. So we've sort of built up the muscle, if you like. So when it comes to something like this, the business knows, okay, we've got people who are actually genuinely working in these areas and doing well and producing results. We should continue to support that. If anyone ever wants to have an offline conversation, I'm happy to help you with that as well.
I just add on two quick things to that. The first is that from our perspective at the Commission, the partnership, I love what you said, Jade, but I actually feel like we got a lot more out of it in the sense that for us, you can operate in a bit of a human rights vacuum at times. And from a business and human rights perspective, you've got to have the practical aspect. So getting to sit down with people who are working day to day in this area and having them be so open with us and say, these are the challenges that we're facing. This is how, this theoretical thing you're talking about would work or not work in practice is so valuable to us, because if you only talk about human rights in theory, but you're not delivering them in practice, you're not really doing what you're meant to be doing. So from our perspective, that practicality is critical. But in terms of businesses starting on that human rights journey, to me, the most important thing is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and not waiting until you have a complete answer to all of the human rights questions, because if you do that, you'll never make a start. And so it literally is about just having that first conversation, taking that first step, downloading the tool off the website, something as simple as that, just to make sure that you're doing things tomorrow that are even just a little bit better or more thought through or more focused on human rights than you did yesterday. And particularly when we're talking AI, nobody has perfect answers because none of us actually know where this is going, and it is moving so quickly. So we have to be open to having those conversations, accepting the fact that we don't have all the answers, but we're going to actually try and just make things a little bit better by thinking through what we're doing and putting human rights in the framework.
Perfect, thank you. We actually have some more questions in the chat, which is great. And from Raoul, we've got the biggest worry is when people think AI is solving problems, but actually it's making them worse. Problems with ethics and explainable AI. Not quite sure. When do you think any tighter regulation is coming from government or banking regulators, but probably likely government?
I wish I could say yesterday, because one of the things we are so conscious of, and I'm not saying that because I want to see a lot of extra regulation. That's actually, you don't want regulation for the sake of regulation. That's not a great idea. But I actually do think we need some focused regulation around, or guardrails around, high-risk AI particularly, so that we can have that certainty and so that we can encourage responsible innovation. I think without those guardrails, I am really worried that that we're going to be playing catch up down the track and trying to put the genie back in the bottle a little bit. I'm concerned that while there's been a lot of consultation in Australia around that, the government released its discussion paper around mandatory guardrails last year. More recently, the discussion has turned to this idea of we need to focus on productivity, and that means getting rid of any talk about regulation. Again, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you harness productivity gains by having effective regulation that provides that certainty. So I guess if I'm forecasting as to where things would go, I would say we actually can't afford to wait for a perfect legislative response, and we actually need businesses themselves to be making decisions around embedding their own frameworks around responsible and ethical AI, for the reasons being that A, it's ethically the right thing to do, B, legally down the track it will come, and it is already in some jurisdictions, which again means for businesses that cross jurisdictional lines, there are legal compliance frameworks you have to think about from an AI perspective. But I think the third and most significant reason from a business perspective is the research is now really growing and pointing to the truth that embedding responsible approaches, ethical approaches, human rights approaches into business actually drives economic success and performance. And so that correlation between human rights and economic growth is significant, and is a reason that I don't think you want to wait for the government to step in and regulate.
Thank you. Comprehensive answer there. A question from Jacqueline. Great discussion. Thank you. This is very valuable and relevant talk. How are you collaborating internally, and with which teams to ensure the full set of human rights issues are considered in AI development, but also, in terms of the supply chain as well? Probably Jade, I'd say.
Yeah, so at NAB we do have an AI framework, and we also have a specific Gen AI program team, and we have to work across teams. So we've got our right at the beginning, our architecture team working with sourcing, working with legal, working with privacy, working with risk. So it tries to follow our existing change management process. But where we're doing things, like I say, we're talking earlier about what is the AI actually doing? Are we talking about something quite small, immaterial? Are we talking about something big? There will be pinpoints as to at what point that certain things triggered. So it's not using personal information, then you're not going to be looking at PIAs. If it's a very basic tool, then it won't trigger other things. So, but yeah, the idea is that it's very much because we have to follow our risk assessment process for anything that we do. This really falls into that approach anyway. But we have got this, I guess, overview over our umbrella, which sort of calls out specific things, sort of the do's and do nots. And I think that direction has been very welcome because, we've got data ethics principles, which we rely very much on all of our data use to use data responsibly, including through the use of AI. But through the AI framework, we've just got some nice, more punchy, specific AI things. And then we can build up precedents from there to say, if the privacy team or ethics team has reviewed X approach for this type of use case, then when we next see that same party come through and it's a similar use case, that builds up momentum. But if it's something completely different, we can ask more questions. And I think that's going to be part of the thing, is to try to understand as we use this more. How do we adjust? Because people probably never use the words the privacy team is super fast, whereas we really are. But it's all the other stuff you have to line up to get to that point. So I think we'll probably, through the use of AI, probably start to find some efficiencies and some increased sort of better processes in sourcing, in third-party management, in a whole bunch of other areas as well. I sort of hope that through AI, because people want act fast, we'll actually have to do better in a whole bunch of other risk areas as well. So I'm sort of excited more than terrified in that respect.
Thank you, Jade. Look, we've hit 11, and look, I feel we could probably go on for quite a bit more, but because you're very passionate about this, and it's a fantastic conversation. So look, a special thank you to Lorraine and the Human Rights Commission for today, and to Jade and NAB, and thank you for bringing sort of to light this, well, apart from bringing attention to this issue, really talking about how it's actually been thought about, not just, applied. The bank has applied this approach, and how you've really thought about it and made it, I think, quite real for most of the people on the call. So anyone on the call, thank you for your participation. But if you do have any follow-up questions or want to reach out, please feel free, reach out through the ABA events email that you would have used for this, to register for this event, and then we can put you in contact with Jade and Lorraine. But yeah, thank you very much, ladies, for a great discussion today. If you wouldn't mind staying on the call just for 1 minute afterwards while everyone drops off, that'd be really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.